The German Wehrmacht appeared invincible in the early years of the war, conquering Europe with astonishing speed and efficiency. This initial success created a pervasive myth of German military supremacy that masked deep structural flaws within their system. The Blitzkrieg strategy was highly effective but relied on a narrow, intense application of mechanized force that was unsustainable for a long-term global conflict. Initial victories consumed vast quantities of men and material that the German industrial base could never truly replace at the required rate. The seemingly endless columns of German infantry marching across the continent conveyed a numerical superiority that was strategically deceptive. Germany's economy was never fully optimized for total war in the same way as the economies of the United States or the Soviet Union. Early campaigns were financed and sustained by the resources plundered from conquered territories, a source that began to dry up and required constant military enforcement. The quality of the initial divisions was exceptionally high, forged through intense pre-war training and the early victories, but this quality was a finite resource. Once these elite divisions suffered heavy casualties, the replacement divisions, though numerous, could not replicate the original combat effectiveness. Hitler's command style increasingly favored aggressive, often reckless offensive operations, consistently pushing his divisions past the point of endurance and logistical support. The reliance on horse-drawn transport for a significant portion of their logistics remained a pre-modern liability in a lightning-fast modern war. Propaganda consistently magnified small victories and concealed catastrophic losses, maintaining the facade of an unbroken fighting force both at home and abroad. The belief in the superiority of their tanks and weapons, while often true on a unit-to-unit comparison, ignored the fundamental mathematical disadvantage in mass production the Allies quickly achieved. This powerful illusion of strength ultimately served to prevent the necessary strategic retreats and reorganizations that might have prolonged the war. The myth proved brittle, and when the cracks finally appeared, the collapse was not a slow concession but a rapid, irreversible fragmentation of military order. The constant demand for more manpower diluted the specialized training and experience that gave the early divisions their lethal edge. Germany was fighting a 20th-century war with a 19th-century resource management philosophy, prioritizing short-term gains over long-term strategic depth. The perception of strength meant no one, not even the Allied planners, truly anticipated the speed at which this seemingly formidable structure would utterly disintegrate in the final phases of the conflict. The control of the skies proved to be one of the most immediate and devastating factors in the rapid collapse of the German divisions on the ground. The initial dominance of the Luftwaffe, a critical enabler of the Blitzkrieg, vanished almost completely by 1944. Allied air forces achieved nearly uncontested air superiority over both the eastern and western fronts, earning the phrase the Allied air umbrella. This control meant that German ground movements, day or night, became extraordinarily hazardous and difficult to coordinate. Any concentration of German troops, armor, or supply vehicles was immediately subject to relentless and accurate aerial attack by fighter bombers. The railway network, the essential artery for the German war machine, was systematically pulverized by targeted Allied bombing campaigns. German divisions attempting to retreat could not escape the constant strafing and bombing, which turned orderly withdrawals into panicked routes. The ability of the Luftwaffe to provide critical close air support for their own troops was almost entirely eliminated. German generals quickly learned that an offensive push could not be sustained without air cover, leading to paralyzing caution on the battlefield. Pilots were often young and inexperienced, a direct result of the Allied destruction of German flight training schools and the continuous attrition of veteran aviators. Fuel shortages, directly caused by bombing of synthetic fuel plants, severely limited the training time for new pilots, compounding their disadvantage against veteran Allied flyers. The loss of reconnaissance planes meant that German commanders were fighting essentially blind, lacking timely and accurate intelligence on Allied troop dispositions and movements. In contrast, Allied divisions operated under a blanket of protection and enjoyed perfect intelligence about German positions, a massive strategic imbalance. The constant threat from the air had a severe psychological toll on the German soldiers, forcing them to spend much of their time seeking shelter rather than engaging the enemy. The air war transformed the battlefield, making large-scale, decisive German counterattacks practically impossible due to the vulnerability of their armored formations. Ground troops became highly demoralized by the realization that their comrades above were no longer able to protect them from the overwhelming enemy air power. The Allied control of the air was a strategic lever that exponentially multiplied the effectiveness of their ground forces and hastened the German decline. The German logistical system was fundamentally flawed from the beginning and proved utterly incapable of sustaining a multi-front, continental war. Despite the highly mechanized image of the Wehrmacht, the majority of its transport, especially for supply lines, still relied on millions of horses and countless wagons. This reliance on slow, vulnerable animal transport severely limited the speed at which divisions could be supplied, especially during offensive operations deep into enemy territory. The infrastructure of the Soviet Union, with its differing rail gauge, presented an immediate and overwhelming logistical bottleneck that was never fully solved. Long and exposed supply lines became prime targets for partisan activity and Allied air interdiction, leading to massive, irreplaceable losses of food, ammunition, and fuel. The constant need to repair and regauge captured Soviet railway lines diverted immense amounts of engineering and labor resources away from the fighting front. German divisions frequently had to halt offensive operations not because of direct enemy engagement, but simply because their supply columns could not keep pace with the advance. The prioritization of resources often favored frontline combat units over the logistical tail, neglecting the very structure that kept the divisions viable. As the divisions were forced into retreat, the logistical collapse accelerated exponentially, as retreat often meant abandoning vast stores of supplies. The famous German efficiency was largely a myth in the logistical domain, characterized by bureaucratic infighting and a severe lack of standardization in equipment and vehicles. Different divisions often used different types of trucks, which complicated maintenance and made the procurement of spare parts a nightmarish local problem. Allied pressure on German-held ports and the unrelenting U-boat war further choked the limited sea routes used for supplies to coastal garrisons. The German system lacked the sheer scale and robust redundancy of the Allied logistical system, which could absorb immense losses and continue to function seamlessly. This ultimate failure in logistics meant that by the late stages of the war, entire German divisions were often combat ineffective, even before seeing action, due to a severe lack of ammunition and adequate fuel. The soldiers were often malnourished and under-equipped for the harsh conditions, directly contributing to a devastating drop in morale and fighting will. Logistical starvation on the front lines, rather than overwhelming enemy fire, became the silent killer of German combat readiness and operational capacity. The lack of critical raw materials, particularly oil, was a terminal disease for the highly mechanized German military apparatus. Germany possessed very few natural oil reserves of its own and relied heavily on imports and the limited output of synthetic fuel plants. The strategic objectives of the entire war were often warped by the desperate need to secure oil fields, most notably the drive towards the Caucasus in the Soviet Union. Once the Allied strategic bombing campaign shifted its focus to Germany's synthetic fuel production facilities, the consequences for the Wehrmacht were swift and devastating. Refineries and hydrogenation plants became primary targets, and their destruction was catastrophic for the mobility of German divisions. Panzer divisions, the very spearhead of the German army, were frequently immobilized, sometimes running out of fuel literally hundreds of yards from the battle. The lack of aviation fuel grounded the Luftwaffe, allowing Allied air supremacy to become a permanent feature of the war. Training of tank crews and pilots had to be drastically curtailed, as the precious few gallons of fuel were reserved for active combat units. New and powerful German weapons, such as the jet-powered Me-262 fighter, could not be deployed in significant numbers or with effective training due to the fuel crisis. Even basic transport and movement of infantry by truck became a near impossible luxury, forcing long, exhausting marches under constant Allied observation. The coal necessary for the industrial war machine also became scarce as Allied bombers disrupted the entire German transportation infrastructure. Shortages extended to essential materials like rubber for tires, strategic metals, and even basic components for rifle production. The inability to consistently replace lost tanks and equipment was directly tied to the lack of raw materials, creating a constant, downward spiral in unit strength. As divisions retreated, the priority became saving men, not equipment, and countless tanks, vehicles, and artillery pieces were destroyed or abandoned for lack of fuel or a tow vehicle. This resource starvation made the German military rigid and unresponsive, unable to execute the flexible, rapid counterattacks that their doctrine demanded. The strategic failure to secure a reliable, long-term source of oil ultimately guaranteed the logistical and operational paralysis that preceded the final collapse. Fighting a protracted war on two geographically and strategically disparate fronts was an impossible drain that no single nation could sustain indefinitely. The massive commitment of manpower and resources to the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union dwarfed all other German military efforts. The vast distances and harsh conditions of the Soviet campaign inflicted unsustainable losses in both men and the most durable military equipment. The need to continuously reinforce the East meant that the West, despite the presence of the Atlantic Wall, was defended by divisions that were often understrength and poorly equipped. Hitler's strategy often involved a hold-at-all-costs mentality, which prevented the strategic withdrawal of troops from less critical sectors to reinforce collapsing fronts. The simultaneous pressure from the Soviet offensives in the East and the Allied landings in the West presented the German High Command with an unsolvable dilemma. Resources intended for the production of tanks or aircraft had to be divided, ensuring neither front received the necessary overwhelming superiority to succeed. The Wehrmacht was forced to transfer divisions back and forth across the continent, a process that was slow, costly in fuel, and highly vulnerable to air interdiction. The constant shifting of units meant that divisions never had the time to properly rest, refit, and integrate replacements before being thrown into the next defensive crisis. The sheer attrition on the Eastern Front bled the Wehrmacht of its best officers, non-commissioned officers, and experienced combat veterans. This forced dilution meant that new divisions formed for the Western Front lacked the necessary core of experienced leaders to withstand the shock of the Allied invasion. The cumulative effect was that German forces were everywhere stretched thin, possessing neither the numbers nor the quality to decisively defeat any major Allied thrust. The strategic flexibility that characterized the early German army was entirely lost, replaced by a desperate, rigid defense dictated by the geographical imperatives of two wars. The combined industrial output and human resources of the Allied powers, including the Soviet Union, simply overwhelmed the German capacity for simultaneous global warfare. The logistical and human cost of maintaining this massive geographical spread became the central, unavoidable cause of the rapid and terminal decline in combat effectiveness. The economic and industrial capacity of the Allied nations, particularly the United States, created a flood of material that drowned the German war effort. The American ability to transition its colossal industrial base to total war production was a strategic marvel of unparalleled scale and speed. German industry, despite its technological innovation, was fragmented, decentralized, and never achieved the mass standardization of Allied production lines. The sheer number of tanks, aircraft, trucks, and ships produced by the Allies far outstripped the German ability to replace its losses. For every tank Germany produced, the Allies could produce multiple, and they could sustain this unequal exchange indefinitely. The standardization of Allied equipment, such as the Sherman tank or the Liberty ship, simplified logistics and maintenance, a concept Germany struggled to implement. The United States became the arsenal of democracy, supplying Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and its own forces with a never-ending stream of equipment. The vast majority of German transport was horse-drawn, while Allied armies were fully mechanized with American-built trucks, giving them a decisive edge in mobility. The quality gap between German and Allied weaponry, while sometimes favorable to the Germans in individual duels, was irrelevant against the overwhelming numerical disparity. Mass production allowed the Allies to treat entire units of equipment as expendable assets, knowing replacements were already on the assembly line. German divisions, already fighting to save their men, were forced to fight with a mindset of scarcity, desperately hoarding every piece of equipment. The psychological impact of facing an enemy who could absorb and replace losses instantly, while the German forces suffered permanent depletion, was immense. This industrial disparity meant that the war was a simple arithmetic problem that Germany could never solve, no matter how skilled its soldiers were. The German system could not withstand the continuous, high-intensity operations of the late war due to the sheer material deficit. The final collapse was a material one as much as a military one, brought about by the crushing weight of Allied factories operating at maximum capacity. The effectiveness of the German divisions was severely compromised by the systematic, self-inflicted decay of their military command structure. Adolf Hitler increasingly centralized all strategic and even tactical decisions to himself, overriding the advice of his most experienced field marshals. This rigid centralization removed the necessary flexibility and operational freedom from commanders on the ground, who were best placed to assess the rapidly changing battlefield. Orders from the Führer's bunker were often based on outdated information, ideological fantasies, or a complete lack of understanding of the realities at the front. Hitler's insistence on holding every piece of territory, regardless of strategic value, led to the needless encirclement and destruction of entire divisions. The concept of elastic defense, a core principle of sound military strategy, was forbidden, forcing divisions to stand and fight in indefensible positions. Disagreements with Hitler often led to the summary dismissal or forced retirement of highly competent generals, replacing them with more compliant, less capable figures. The fear of contradicting the Führer created a culture of sycophancy and prevented the honest reporting of catastrophic losses and dire logistical situations. Field commanders, knowing a strategic retreat could lead to a court-martial, often delayed necessary movements until it was too late to save their units. The attempted assassination plot of 1944 further hardened Hitler's resolve and led to a brutal purge of the officer corps, eliminating many of the Wehrmacht's finest military minds. The influence of the Nazi Party's political commissars, the Nationalsozialistische Führungsoffizier, NSFO, within the divisions further politicized military decision-making. This ideological interference prioritized loyalty to the regime over military necessity and sound tactical judgment. As the lines collapsed, the fractured command structure proved incapable of mounting the large-scale, coordinated counterattacks needed to stabilize the fronts. The inherent genius of the German military system, decentralized command and initiative, was slowly suffocated by its own supreme commander. The ultimate collapse was thus not just a defeat on the battlefield but a failure of leadership rooted in the delusional megalomania of the regime's leader. The round-the-clock strategic bombing campaign conducted by the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces had a profound and accelerating effect on the German collapse. The primary goal of the bombing evolved from targeting cities to a systematic destruction of Germany's industrial and economic infrastructure. The precision bombing of the oil and synthetic fuel industry was particularly crippling, as detailed in an earlier section, directly immobilizing armored divisions. Targets included ball-bearing factories, which are essential for nearly all military equipment, and engine production facilities, starving the Luftwaffe of new aircraft. The persistent attacks on the German railway system destroyed marshalling yards, rolling stock, and key bridges, preventing the timely movement of troops and supplies. This disruption meant that supplies often sat idle in depots while divisions on the front line starved for ammunition and fuel. The constant need to defend the homeland forced the diversion of thousands of anti-aircraft guns and hundreds of thousands of personnel away from the fighting fronts. These highly valuable resources were tied up in defense, instead of being used to equip and reinforce the collapsing divisions at the front. The Allied bombing not only destroyed production but also forced German industry to disperse its factories underground or into smaller, less efficient sites. This frantic and desperate relocation drastically slowed production rates and complicated the already strained logistical network for parts and raw materials. The morale of the civilian population was severely damaged, leading to a general decline in the efficiency of the workforce and increased labor unrest. The effort to clean up the rubble and restore essential services further diverted manpower that could have been used in the factories or at the front. The strategic bombing campaign created a second front within Germany itself, compounding the resource crisis and accelerating the breakdown of social order. While bombing alone did not win the war, it was the essential precondition for the rapid collapse of the Wehrmacht by ensuring their divisions were materially and logistically crippled before the final ground assault. The widespread and relentless partisan, resistance, and guerrilla warfare across occupied Europe acted as a constant, attritional drain on the German military's strength. German divisions were required to divert a significant percentage of their combat troops away from the front lines to conduct grueling, costly security and anti-partisan duties. These operations tied down hundreds of thousands of soldiers who were desperately needed to stem the tide of the Soviet and Western Allied offensives. Partisan groups specialized in sabotage, targeting supply lines, communication cables, key infrastructure like bridges and railway tracks. The cumulative effect of this sabotage was a continuous and subtle strangulation of the German logistical network, complementing the Allied bombing campaign. The German response to partisan activity was often characterized by brutal reprisals against the civilian population, which only served to further galvanize the resistance. The perpetual threat of ambush and attack created an atmosphere of fear and exhaustion for the occupation troops, leading to significant drops in morale and discipline. Units involved in anti-partisan warfare, often rear-echelon divisions or static garrison troops, were prevented from training for mobile combat, making them ineffective when called to the front. In Yugoslavia, the German need to combat Tito's highly organized partisans tied up 20 to 30 divisions for years, representing a massive strategic cost. The resistance provided critical intelligence to the Allied forces, helping them pinpoint German deployments, supply depots, and strategic weaknesses. The constant, low-level casualties suffered in anti-partisan operations, while small individually, added up to an immense and irreplaceable loss of men over the course of the war. The D-Day landings were significantly aided by the French resistance, who severely hampered German efforts to rush reinforcements to the invasion beaches. Partisan activity fundamentally destabilized the German occupation, creating a vast, hostile hinterland instead of a secure logistical base. This unseen warfare meant that German divisions were being worn down from within and without, hastening the general state of disarray and making coordinated resistance impossible. The catastrophic loss of Germany's most experienced combat personnel was a permanent wound that ultimately crippled the combat effectiveness of its divisions. The continuous, high-intensity fighting on the Eastern Front, particularly the battles for Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kursk, bled the Wehrmacht of its best and brightest. The high casualty rates meant that the corps of veteran soldiers, non-commissioned officers, NCOs, and mid-level officers who imparted training and discipline were gone forever. Replacements were increasingly drawn from older men previously deemed medically unfit, and, tragically, very young teenagers. These new recruits, often called Volkssturm or Hitler Youth, lacked the physical conditioning, combat training, and mental fortitude of the pre-war army. The necessary time for proper training was drastically cut, as new men were rushed to the front to fill the gaping holes in the line. A division's true strength lies not just in its numbers but in the quality and experience of its small unit leaders, and this quality was rapidly diluted. The loss of an experienced NCO, the backbone of any army, meant that a platoon or company lacked the immediate, practical leadership needed during chaotic combat. As a result, new divisions were often brittle, prone to panic under heavy fire, and lacked the cohesion necessary to execute complex maneuvers or sustain defensive operations. The veteran troops who remained were severely fatigued, suffering from combat stress, and often demoralized by the constant stream of green, ill-equipped replacements. The German system began to rely on these increasingly weaker formations, unable to hold ground against the veteran, well-supported Allied and Soviet armies. The decline in the average age and experience of the fighting man translated directly into higher casualty rates, creating a vicious cycle of attrition and decline. The final German divisions were often divisions in name only, formations that possessed only a fraction of their original personnel, training, and equipment strength. The German military was ultimately defeated by a failure to protect and replace its human capital, the most precious resource in any long war. The overall qualitative decline of the German fighting unit was a direct consequence of the compounded strategic and material failures of the war. As divisions suffered crippling losses, the practice of cannibalization became common, where surviving elements of one shattered division were absorbed by another. This created hodgepodge formations lacking a cohesive history, tradition, or consistent level of training and equipment. Equipment was increasingly non-standardized, with divisions using a mix of captured foreign weapons, outdated German models, and hastily produced late-war designs. The legendary German standardization was lost, leading to massive logistical problems in supplying ammunition, spare parts, and even basic uniforms. New tanks and armored vehicles, while often technically superior, were rushed into production with insufficient testing, leading to frequent mechanical breakdowns. The quality of the replacement troops meant that the average level of combat skill and endurance within a division was drastically lower than in 1941. Discipline also eroded as the war became a desperate struggle for survival, and the political aims of the conflict seemed increasingly futile. Divisions that were initially equipped with the best armored vehicles were reduced to relying on infantry, often with limited motor transport. The designation of a panzer division in late 1944 often masked a unit that possessed only a handful of operational tanks and severely understrength infantry. Hitler's repeated insistence on creating entirely new formations from scratch, instead of properly refitting existing, experienced divisions, further diluted the manpower pool. The pressure to maintain a front line forced commanders to accept units that were clearly not combat-ready, sacrificing long-term viability for immediate defensive presence. The cumulative effect was that the average German division was a shadow of its former self, a fragile construct that would shatter quickly under sustained Allied pressure. The enemy's divisions, meanwhile, were gaining experience, benefiting from superior supply, and maintaining their structural integrity. This widening qualitative gap ensured that when the final offensives came, the brittle German line had no inherent depth or resilience left to sustain itself. The rapid collapse of the German divisions was the inevitable and accelerating culmination of all the strategic mistakes, logistical failures, and material deficiencies. By 1944, the Wehrmacht was trapped in a death spiral where every failure compounded the next with disastrous speed. Logistical breakdown led to immobility, which allowed Allied air power to achieve total dominance, which then paralyzed command. The loss of quality manpower forced the recruitment of ill-trained youths, which led to a collapse of unit cohesion, which guaranteed higher casualty rates. The two-front war ensured that every resource was divided, preventing the Germans from ever concentrating enough force to win a decisive victory. Hitler's fanatical command structure removed any possibility of a sound strategic retreat or the creation of a stable, defensible line. The Allied forces, on the other hand, had perfected the art of combined arms warfare, coordinating air, armor, artillery, and infantry with unprecedented effectiveness. The sheer mass of Allied and Soviet manpower and material became an irresistible wave that the exhausted German divisions could no longer contain. The final surrender was not a single event but a series of cascading collapses along the entire front, where organized resistance suddenly gave way to mass capitulation. Individual divisions, finding themselves cut off, out of fuel, and lacking communication or command, simply ceased to function as military units. The myth of the unwavering German soldier finally broke under the weight of total material and strategic inferiority. The divisions collapsed faster than anyone expected, not due to a single, sudden defeat, but because the foundation of the German war machine had been systematically hollowed out for years. The speed of the final collapse was merely the final, dramatic evidence of a structural disintegration that had long passed the point of no return. The war's end was a race between the final breakdown of German military cohesion and the last Allied drive, a race the Wehrmacht was destined to lose quickly.